Really going to round out our whole day and our conversations. So thank you all for staying and listening, and I hope you've really enjoyed this full day and even yesterday in the virtual conversations. I was just in one of the breakout sessions, and my head is kind of swimming in fantastic information, so I hope you feel the same. One thing that I told the breakout session is really look around the room. These are your peers in global development. A lot of you live in Seattle. I hope that you can exchange information and continue these partnerships, continue these connections, lean on each other. We were reflecting that sometimes global development is not easy, and it actually can take a personal toll. We want to create part of the ecosystem and the community for global development within Global Washington is some self-help in terms of leaning on each other. So please connect and continue these connections after this conference as well. So our next session I'm really excited about because we've talked about this, but we want to talk about it a little more deeper, because we've heard comments that funding and philanthropists and institutional funders, they can have an influence over how local the proximity and the localization that happens in global development. Sometimes there are funders that give directly to community-based organizations. There's others that give and there's subgrants. There's other forms of giving that can influence, again, the degree to which we can do the co-creation that we've all been talking about. So this next session is going to dive into that a little bit more from a funder's perspective. And we're thrilled too because we have, again, what we've learned from COVID, we can use technology in different ways. We have Michele Sumilas, who is in Washington, D.C., because she couldn't fly out here. But we're going to have a Zoom conversation with her, and then it'll be followed by another panel discussion. So I'm going to briefly introduce Michele, but again, her bio is right in Whova. So again, click on that. She has had a fantastic background and a career in both government and iNGOs. So she has direct experience working in the field with iNGOs as well. Her current title is Assistant to the Administrator of the Bureau for Policy, Planning, and Learning. She's working on, if you heard Dagan earlier, USAID is making this commitment to localization and community building, and she's helping in that. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So Michele, can you hear me?
Kristen, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. If we can get the volume up a little bit on that, that'd be great. I can hear you. Great. Michele, thank you so much for joining us virtually.
I'm really glad that I can do this. I'm really sorry I could not come out to Seattle, but I actually need to leave for Geneva on Saturday morning, so it just did not work. But I'm really excited to be here for a second year in a row and to be able to talk about USAID's localization or locally led development agenda.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm going to ask Michele a few questions so that she can tell you more about her work. So Michele, first, again, we've heard a bit about USAID's focus and commitment to localization. And for some of our attendees who may not be so familiar with it, can you just walk us through some of the overarching principles of this localization effort?
Sure, I am super excited to talk about our localization effort. It's something that we've been really working very hard on since, well, USAID has always worked on locally led development, but with Administrator Powers' speech, where she laid out her vision last November, she made it very clear that her vision for our agency was that we would never, it's very clear that never before have our fates been so intertwined with those of people around the world, her words. And she said that the solutions to these interconnected challenges lies within the unique consequences, power dynamics, and impacts on the communities that they touch. And this is really at the heart of our approach to locally led development. We are talking about working to tip the balance of power and resources towards those who live and work in the places where we have missions and we have offices. In doing so, we're really talking about elevating the voices of local experts, which also will include for sure women, LGBTQI, and Indigenous peoples populations, as well as lots of other powerful change agents who have historically been left out, ignored, or silenced during debates. We really see this about as a way of recognizing that development agencies like USAID, we don't direct or drive development by ourselves, but we need to be able to support and catalyze local change processes. And we believe that this will lead to better, more sustainable, more equitable ways of delivering foreign assistance. We are trying to create spaces that will drive this change in the communities in which we work. And we are working to make reforms within USAID to make this possible and to shift the mindset within USAID. So it's not about one initiative, one policy, or one strategy, but it's a whole of agency effort. You all might remember USAID Forward, which was a priority during the Obama administration, where we called for 30% of our resources to go to local organizations. This is actually taking our USAID Forward processes and taking it up like 10 notches. I was here during that time and worked on it. So it is about setting a target. Administrator Power has set goals, and we are saying that by 2025, we will provide at least a quarter of all of our program funds directly to local partners. This will ramp up the percentage. We'll be releasing numbers in March that will set what has happened in 21 and 22. We think we're between 7 and 10% of our resources currently going towards local partners, but we're talking about moving to a 25% target. And we're taking new steps to get us there. She's also challenged us to create space for local communities to be part of the conversation, whether that is developing our priorities with us, managing the design and implementation of the work, measuring the results, evaluating that work. And the target for that is that at least half of our programs will have this component. So we're already starting. We've done a ton of work already. We've updated our risk tolerance strategy. We're addressing regulatory barriers. There's actually a webinar tomorrow for our global health partners that says, what are the barriers you're facing? And we're trying to kind of tick through those one by one. We also just recently set in place a policy where our new funding opportunity calls for proposals will be written in local languages and in languages other than English, which we think is a very important new development. And finally, we've released our new local capacity strengthening policy, which establishes principles to ensure that our work responds to local priorities and builds on the existing strength. As I said before, this is not a new strategy. We've done it a lot, but we really are trying to reflect on lessons learned. We're trying to change ourselves. We're trying to change the incentives within the organization. We're doing things as boring as changing the requirements for promotion in the foreign service at USAID to require that people talk about and make sure that they are working with local communities when they do their annual review. So we think the moment is different and we're prepared to meet it. In addition to working on ourselves, working with our partners, trying to change the way we work, we're also trying to be a global advocacy voice. And we are working with other donor partners to hopefully release a donor statement at the Global Partnership meeting next week, really pushing other donor partners to join us in this locally led development push. So I look forward to providing more detail, but I'll stop there.
Great. That really reflects a lot of what we've been talking about too, in terms of it's both the kind of the tactical, but also the mind shift. And I'm sure at USAID that will take a little longer, but it sounds like it's really working well. My next question is really around a topic that's come up again around the idea of localization that spurred a lot of discussion around risk, or I would say perceived risk. And whether ceding more control to local actors could be riskier for donors and assistance providers. So how is USAID addressing this issue of risk?
So first of all, I just want to thank you for saying perceived risk. It's a perception that we're increasing our risk. I think that what we're trying to do is really change the conversation. So one of the important steps that we think we need to take is to, as you said, reconsider our posture towards risk. As we've consistently demonstrated, we take very seriously, USAID does, our responsibility to the American people to be good stewards of those taxpayer dollars. But we also do believe that development work comes with risks. There's programmatic risks, there's financial risks, there's reputational risks. And so we're trying to work with and we believe that working with partners who are new to USAID may introduce a different set of risks, but we do not believe that local partners are somehow inherently more risky just by virtue of being local. And so I just want to quote Administrator Power, who said, there is risk in any kind of partnership, and by only working with long-established partners, what we risk missing out on are new opportunities to support and elevate local change makers best positioned to advance their own progress in their own communities. So we believe that by diversifying our partner base, we will diversify our risk. But we also feel that there's a risk in not working with new partners. So earlier this year, USAID updated our risk appetite statement, which I'm sorry to be so bureaucratic, but it's a really important statement. It's something that our missions look at. And this new statement reflects the broader conception of risk, clarifying that we do not, in fact, clarifying that we do have a high appetite for taking smart and disciplined risks when we work with local partners, because we think the opportunities from our equitable and sustainable development outcomes are so great. So we are proactively identifying and mitigating those risks and working in collaboration with our partners to do that. And we also are working with our existing iNGO partners and other implementing partners for them to help us think about what are the types of support we should provide to local agencies, local organizations to make them most successful. One of the questions we get asked all the time is about indirect costs. It's about flexible funding. And we are working right now on trying to figure out if we can create some pots of money that are flexible. We have Local Solutions, which is a program that's worked for a long time that provides this kind of flexible funding, which we can talk about later. And we want to see if we can provide more of that because we understand that organizations need that core funding to exist, not just project-oriented funding.
That's great. No, thank you for sharing all that. So also, can you tell us a little bit more about how USAID is using lessons learned from previous efforts and sources of evidence and information about localization, and how will you be doing monitoring and evaluation around this?
So a couple things I'll say. I'm going to first say that we are taking lessons learned from our flagship Local Works program that provides long-term flexible discretionary funding to small creative organizations. We know that this flexible funding is really important, and it helps to build the capacity or expand the capacity of our local partners to be effective leaders and change agents in their own local systems. We're also working with our missions at a regional level to think about whether there are mechanisms we need to set up that will provide some of the back-end support to local organizations so that they don't all have to build these extensive systems that so many of our NGOs have built, that have all kinds of complicated accounting systems, et cetera, et cetera. If we could have organizations that provide that support to local organizations, many local organizations in a country or in a region, we believe that would be more effective. We also have learned that localization is staff intensive. And so Administrator Powers worked with the Congress to get additional staff allocated to USAID. And we are recognizing that those staff need to also reflect the diversity, equity, and inclusion goals and priorities of this administration. And so we're working very quickly to hire additional staff. We're also working very carefully with our Foreign Service national staff. Over 70% of our staff in our missions are Foreign Service nationals who are best positioned to help us with this locally led development agenda. And they're working beautifully with their partners on the ground in doing that. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about the targets. In the past, we've applied targets, our 30% target, for example, with USAID Forward, in an across-the-board way. And we feel like that has actually undermined the overall efforts. So we are working very carefully with our missions, and we believe that we will come out in the first quarter with our targets for each country, which will, and we want to make sure that those country targets are responsive to the local environment. So there'll be some countries that we know will want to do 50 or 60% of their resources in their programs through local organizations. And there'll be some countries where they will not be able to do that at all because the risks are just too high. And so we're going to try to be flexible and to be responsive to the local conditions. Finally, we are really focused on building the evidence base for how locally led development leads to more sustainable development. And so we are working with the new chief economist to develop a research agenda around locally led development so we can begin to build that research base for why this is important. Finally, we're developing new tools, new types of awards. Some of you may remember we developed some co-creation type awards during some prior administrations, and we're thinking about what is the next generation co-creation award. What is the next generation type of award that we need to provide to local actors? Because local actors need different kinds of funding, different types of requirements than iNGOs and large implementing partners need. And all of them can be contributing to what we're doing. Finally, one of the exciting things that we're also working on is we're working with local evaluation and monitoring experts in the countries where we work. And we hope to be able to set up networks of local researchers and evidence organizations who will be able to then work with our missions to provide locally led evaluation and monitoring of our programs, which we believe is a very innovative part of this effort as well.
That recently you've been able to visit some of your missions. So can you tell us a little bit about what you an example of what you see as localization for USAID?
Yeah, so we recently in May and June, late May, early June, we spent about a week with our USAID mission in Kenya, which was a great experience. Kenya is one of our standout locally led development missions. They have a country development cooperation strategy that focuses on locally led development, and they have been moving most of their awards to local organizations. They're maximizing ownership, results, and inclusivity, and their foreign service nationals are leading this effort. One of the projects that we visited was really focused on the wildlife issues in Kenya. We know that for many generations, wildlife have lived and roamed in the rangelands, and these are the same rangelands that the Maasai depend on given their pastoral lifestyles. And increasingly, these rangelands were becoming private lands, and that the wildlife was migrating, and the populations were decreasing as a result. There were also there was a loss of wildlife, a loss of grasslands because of overgrazing. And so the question that we had, and this was like 20 years ago, was how we protect both the wildlife, but also the livelihoods of the Maasai, and also work with private landowners to make this all possible. So with USAID support, we were able to establish the Masai Mara Wildlife Conservation Association, which are all locally led conservation associations, bringing together 22 environmental conservancies composed of more than 16,000 landowners, many Maasai. And these landowners receive rental payment for setting land aside for wildlife. And the payments are funded largely by tourism fees and to a lesser extent support from granting agencies. So we were really impressed when we were there. The Conservancy has made incredible impacts on both the people in the community as well as the wildlife. There's invaluable protection provided to approximately 741,000 acres of potential habitat for endangered Kenyan wildlife. And each year through its associate conservancies, it distributes more than $7.5 million to landowners. In addition to creating employment in the tourism industry, allowing them to graze on the land in a very sustainable way, and investing in local services and infrastructure. They were able to use some of these resources to build hospitals, schools, all kinds of things. And so this is a story of the Masai Mara taking kind of control of their local land, adjusting to the time and supporting tourism, but also getting paid for that. And then being able to use those resources, as we've learned, cash assistance often is very successful in improving the lives of those who are provided that assistance. So we were impressed by the fact that local communities were part of that work, and how much we were able to then have an impact not only on those local communities, but also on our climate change, our biodiversity, and also even our agriculture goals. So it's just one example of what we're doing.
That's fantastic. Michele, thank you for taking the time to speak to our community here. Definitely next time you're in Seattle, we'll gather so that you can see everybody in person. But thank you again for being here. And it sounds like there's a lot of progress being made. So So thank you for being there, and we hope you continue with that progress.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And we may be out in Seattle in the first quarter of 2023, so I will definitely be in touch. I hope the rest of the conference goes well, and thank you so much for the focus on these issues.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Great, we're gonna jump right into the continuation of that panel. I'm gonna invite our panelist and our moderator, Akhtar, Jay, and Birger, up to the stage. And again, we're talking more about the funding, influence, and localization.
Thank you very much. And it's been just a fantastic day, right? What do you think? So these guys now have a tough act to follow. That's what I was told at lunch, by the way. No, but it's been great, right? So Birger and Jay, thank you very much for, first of all, supporting Global Washington, being members, being part of this community. I want to kind of start off by just asking you both to, if you can, reflect on the day that's happened, but in the context of the work that you both are doing with your organizations and how trust plays into it. So, Birger, do you want to go first? And I'm not going to introduce themselves because, again, as it's been told lots of times this morning, there is the Hoover app and everything is there. So, Birger.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks to Kristen and her team at Global Washington for allowing me to be part of this. Is my microphone on?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it.
Now
is
it's
my
on.
microphone on now?
Mine is working.
Yeah, now it's
All
on.
right, great. Okay. So I was just saying thanks to Kristen and the Global Washington team for allowing me to be part of this conversation, which I think is going to be really interesting. And I've really found the conference to be really relevant to the work that we do. This morning, for example, I was part of the Women of the World breakfast and listened to Ms. Javed, the head of the Mona Foundation. And she was talking about how their foundation looks at impact by allowing local organizations and local leaders to lead the development in their own communities. And that really reflects, I think, a lot of what Give to Asia also does and aspires to do in some cases. Our tagline as an organization is local knowledge counts. And we are an advised grant maker that supports funders in the United States and in other parts of the world to give directly to local organizations in the Asia-Pacific region. And in an environment like Asia, which is quite diverse in terms of language, in terms of the culture or the working culture in different markets, and also just the attitude for the incoming funding from international sources, the idea of building trust and and creating relationships between international funders and local organizations is really important and part of what we do. We see ourselves as a bridge builder between those local organizations and international funders. I guess that we have, I was thinking about one of our funders when I was listening to the Mona Foundation presentation. She's sort of our ideal funder. She's here in the US, and she'll fund a broad number of different kinds of projects. She'll fund healthcare, education, environmental programs. What she's really looking for is strong leadership with the local organizations that she's funding, and that's how she ends up building trust with those organizations. She goes to Asia, she meets those organizations, gets to know the leadership team, and when she trusts what they're doing, she'll fund with unrestricted grants. She'll listen to what projects they're doing and really let them lead the programming. And that's similar in the way that we work. We want the local organizations to envision what the program is, to define the programs and the grants, and of course to lead the programs. We find that trust is a two-way street, though, and I think that's the other piece of this conversation around trust that probably could be explored more. I think we talk a lot about how do funders trust the local organizations enough to let them lead, but I think the other part of that conversation is the trust that the local organizations need to see from international funders. They need to know that that the funders that are coming in trust their leadership, trust the vision that they have for their local community. And I think that's the two-way street of trust that's really important in trust-based philanthropy.
So Birger, just if you can just do a little bit more on Give to Asia.
Sure.
Right? I mean, I'm hoping that most of you have actually stopped at their desk and got some insight of what they do, but I'd love to know a little bit more about how you're set up,
Sure.
kinds of services you provide, and why that's such an important way to kind of think about
Sure.
how you do philanthropy.
Yeah, and again, our role is primarily as this bridge between funders and, in many cases, very local organizations. We are a 501c3 public charity. We're based down in San Francisco, but we have a presence in different places in the United States. We also have a PBI in Australia, so we work with funders in Australia. We have a private foundation in Hong Kong, so we work with funding that's coming out of Hong Kong as well. But the whole model is around, well, we use the donor-advised fund model to work with donors who have very specific ideas or objectives with their private philanthropy to local communities. So that's a key part of the relationship that we have with funders. We also have what we call friends funds, and this is not necessarily so unique, but I think it's one of the most useful mechanisms for us to provide unrestricted funding to local organizations in Asia. And what we do is we set up funds on the behalf of organizations that are in Asia under our 501c3, and then they can get basically unrestricted funding from funders in the US, and then they define how those programs are going to be, how those funds are going to be programmed. And that's, those are our two key areas of work. I will say that we also see ourselves as a philanthropic infrastructure builder. This summer we launched something called Disaster Link because we're trying to drive more private philanthropy funding in the wake of disasters to local responders in countries where there are disasters, and Asia is one of the most disaster-prone regions. So we're setting up in all of the countries where we work at least 4 partners, local partners that we've vetted in each market that can directly receive donations and that are most likely going to be responding in the case of a disaster. So those kinds of mechanisms and tools that help drive philanthropy to the more local organizations is what we're about. And
you get funding from both individuals and companies, correct?
Yeah, it's pretty even. We have about 50% of our funding comes from corporate philanthropy and community engagement programs, and the other 50% comes from families and individuals and private foundations.
Jay, share a little bit about your work, again, reflections on the conference and trust space.
Right. First of all, thank you very much, and pleasure to be here, and thank you, Kristen, for inviting the Global Washington to inviting me. What a wonderful day, and I'm so pleased to see so many of you still in the audience, and you're here to hear me. But somebody told me earlier there's a cocktail hour after
That's right. Everybody's got a ticket.
So I'm glad there's a cocktail hour, so you're here for us. So no, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Ours is a little bit of a mixed bag. We are Sehgal Foundation is an implementing organization, but we are also doing funding as well. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. So in how we look at things. So I will talk a little bit about our funding philosophy, how we look at organizations to fund. And so it's absolutely our way of doing the things is that we have seen organizations have approached us. We see them, most of our funding goes to India for various projects. Now we look at where do we have expertise of our own, which is rural development. We all came from, our family came from agriculture background, so we do a lot of agriculture work ourselves and rural development work, which goes on, that's the implementation side of the Sehgal Foundation. Then we also look at the areas that impacts the environment and those aspects also, where we have no expertise of our own, where we look at our partners to take the projects forward. Now there, we have only a handful of organizations. We don't do a broad area of funding, but on the environmental issues, climate change issues, we work with a few organizations. And we got to know these organizations in a very informal way. We don't have a formal process where we go out there and do the funding to these organizations. They are known to us. We knew them, and they approached us. We went ahead. And so our philosophy is that we trust these organizations. We get the money out to them, not depending on, they are making an impact. They are the specialists, not get involved in their processes. Why did you do this? And why did you, we are not experts, and we have no right to give any inputs as to how they're doing things. We don't get in too many reporting structures and those type of things. So it's a very straightforward funding methodologies that we use. Similarly, we do a little bit of funding with the organizations in the US. You may have heard this World Food Prize, for example. We do funding to them, and there's smaller other funding that we do in the community, again, which aligns with our main thinking of why the foundation was established. We particularly focus on the education, agriculture, and rural youth development, those type of areas within the US that we do fund in our aspect.
So I'm just going to follow up with you again, Jay. Just talk a little bit about the origin of the foundation.
Oh, yes, yeah. So the foundation is started by Dr. Sehgal and his wife, Edda Sehgal. Suri is a renowned agriculture scientist, and so this is why everybody I meet and say, oh, you based in Seattle? No, I'm based in Des Moines, Iowa, and they all look at it. Des Moines, Iowa, and all of you guys are laughing. So why Des Moines, Iowa? So as I said, Suri is an agriculture scientist who worked for a very large seed company in Des Moines, which used to be called Pioneer, and today is called Corteva. And Suri was contribution to the organization was Pioneer used to be a very regional organization, and by him joining in very early 60s, he ended up taking that organization to over 100 countries around the world. Very, very successful businessman, leaving Pioneer at that particular time and setting up his own organizations. Again, that's what he does. Seed business, setting up seed business around the world. Again, very successful. Within 10 years, a large seed company came and they said they want to buy us out. And at that time, family was also ready to get into the third phase of what Suri called in his life, is getting into the philanthropy aspect. So we sold the companies, and most of the proceeds that came from the sale was put aside into this project. Now, all along Suri's life, he has worked with the farmers, very poor farmers in India, in Africa. So he has seen what the farmers go through and why the development. So he put most of his resources going towards the rural development aspect. So he wants to focus on the rural, especially empowering the farmers, empowering their agriculture practices, and making an impact in those particular regions.
And if you don't mind, I'll just continue one more
Absolutely.
question with you. So US based, but now you actually set up a presence in India.
Right.
Why did that change come about? And how has that shifted your ability to co-create and build trust?
Yeah, so we started out, you're absolutely right, we started out as a funding organization, purely a funding organization. And again, we set certain ideas, certain mission and vision for the organization, as I said, agriculture and the youth development. And so we started funding various organizations in India, which were doing work in the rural development, youth development, those areas of our focus. This was 23 years ago. It's not in today's world, things have changed a lot. But 23 years ago, when we were doing these things, we all came from a business background. Our philosophy is we want to see impact. We want to see things turn around. So when we were funding these organizations in India, maybe we were impatient at that particular time. We didn't see the results or your impact of your investment. You're not seeing it in a very short period that we were funding. That was our main reason at that particular time. Again, we talk about more we brought very bright, very top organizations in India. We brought them all together, and to have a discussion as to how an organization like us can make an impact, do work. And the result that came out, because not very many organizations were working in the agriculture field, because we want to be very particularly working with the farmer, especially the last mile. There are many organizations who are doing a lot of other research work, but the last mile solution was not there. So this is where all the top organizations we brought together, the key thing they said was, you need to get into implementation yourself, because the family brings certain knowledge in that particular area, so you need to be in the front line instead of doing the funding. And that's how we established the organization in India to carry forward. That's why I said I wear two hats. One is the funding hat and a funder hat. So the implementation side, I look after the implement. On the other hand, we do raise funds and we give funds as well. So we have three different origins. So going back to your question, why did we establish ourselves in India? To make sure that we reach out to the last mile farmers, reach out with the technologies and make an impact in the poor villagers' lives, and through that our direct implementation aspect.
And hopefully you become a little bit more patient in that process.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's how we learn. Yes.
That's the learning,
Yeah.
right? No, I mean, it's true, right? I mean, all of us are extremely impatient to see quick change. But if you're talking about co-creation, if you're talking about trust, and if you're talking about transformation of lives, and if you heard our plenary keynote speaker in the morning about farmers and the community, the change takes a while. So how do we kind of shift the ethos of people that are actually funding to look at it in a slightly different lens than a very impatient business lens? So with that, Birger, so you are facilitating with Give to Asia, this cross-border giving to organizations in Asia. You've also seen a rise in philanthropy in Asia. More local folks are setting up their own foundations and funding work there. How is that working out for you? And have you been able to overcome some barriers where people face, especially from giving from here into organizations that are distant? And then I have another question based on our conversation last night over dinner, so I'll come back to you on that.
We just finished research and published a research study on cross-border giving in Asia. For Asia, it was a study that was partly funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, also in partnership with Asia Philanthropy Circle in Singapore and the King Baldwin Foundation in Europe, looking at what are the barriers for cross-border giving in the region, and within the region, for the region. And I think some of those barriers may also exist on the U.S. side. I think some of them are universal, and trust is certainly one of the big ones. Yep. And earlier we were talking about how important it is to create an environment where trust can be built between funders and local organizations. The other one is making sure that funders have the information on where to fund. I think a lot of funders who are thinking about giving internationally may have a sense of where or what kind of issues they want to fund, but trying to figure out, especially when you're thinking about a project that's 6,000 miles away, who do you trust, but also how do you get the information on what kinds of options there are and make a decision on making that making that first grant to an organization that you may end up building trust with over time. Getting that information isn't always that easy. And the reason I think that's really true in the US and also in Asia is that if you look at disaster giving overseas, it's much higher. And that's if you take the time frame away and narrow it down to almost nothing, and you just make it almost a giving from the heart, which it should be for disaster, you get so much more cross-border giving. But when there's time to go through an analysis and process and try to get the information to make a more thoughtful decision, I guess, then that becomes a barrier for cross-border giving. And then I guess related to that is that if we're talking about giving locally, what we've found is that when you're truly talking about giving locally, the local organizations are not very good international fundraisers.
Yes.
They don't have internal capacity. And I don't know actually that we want them to be good international fundraisers. We want them to stay focused on the work that they're doing. And so I think there's a challenge there, creating that connection, and lack of information, a lack of outreach when you're talking about local organizations. And I think where that gap needs to be filled is in the countries where those local organizations are based. There needs to be stronger national level association or promotion for those local causes that maybe houses the communication with the international funding community. Because again, we want the local organizations to get the direct funding. We don't necessarily want them to become marketing agencies. We want them to become doers. Yeah.
So last night when we were talking, and you actually brought this up even just now, on increased funding for during disasters.
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about what you saw during COVID and the experience that you went through in terms of how people showed up. Can you just share a little bit, and how can you capitalize on that going forward?
Yeah, and that definitely falls, even though the pandemic was a protracted, long-term disaster, it was certainly more of a disaster scenario where people were truly impassioned and wanting to give, and they saw a need across from their own borders and wanted to give globally. In fact, one of the trends that we saw, which we hadn't seen before, was that there was actually, we were working with funders in Hong Kong who wanted to support PPEs and health programs for COVID in the United States. Yeah. And that was great. And I think we continue to have those conversations with funders in places like Singapore and in Hong Kong and Australia, where there's interest in giving to the United States, and there's sort of now a two-way connection in terms of the flow of philanthropy, which is great to see. Yeah.
Great. Last question to both of you. What are some of the lessons that you have learned from the work that you are doing? And what advice do you have for all of us that are practicing, are working hard for co-creation and building trust? Just a few thoughts and some key lessons that you've learned from your work. Either decide who wants to go first. Jay?
I mean, lessons, we always said, don't be afraid of making mistakes. You know, I mean, I know that sometimes we get so cautious into doing something, and that we know it's good, but we are cautious as not to do it, you know. So we always said, try it out, and if we fail, nothing doing. We learn something from it, and we move on. It's an investment where we also learn something from it. So I think one of the things is that don't be afraid of taking risk, and don't be afraid of failing, because one of the things that we get trapped on is that it's a failure and we won't succeed in that. Not everything is going to create a success. Only, as you know from the startups, only 10% of the startups actually succeed. So, and similarly, I think in the funding regions, we do fund things, and we realize some things have not worked out, you know, and so we backed away from those things. And From the implementation side, what we do in India, we have tremendous learning experience over the years where we have made many mistakes and we have made tremendous progress. But that helped us quite a bit in really crystallizing our thought at what makes an impact and what does not bring an impact. So how do you skin the fat and how do you focus on what you want to get done in the community? So I think that's the learning experiences that the Sehgal Foundation has gone through from the side of implementation as well as from the funding aspects of it.
We've certainly learned a lot from trial and error over the past 20 years. I think one of the key things that keeps getting reinforced every time we're working is to truly let the local leaders lead. And I think I can't be said enough. And I actually have an example of something we did where we didn't follow that advice and things didn't work out as smoothly at the start. So we were responding to Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines. We were working with a community near Giwan, and we were working on helping rebuild homes. And there was huge community buy-in on this project. There was a local landowner who donated lands for people for these new homes to be built on. And we were working with a nonprofit that does architectural work, and there was some discrepancy in the design where the architect had sort of best practice designs, and this is what the homes should look like, and the local community said, this is all great, but when the rains hit, they're going to hit these walls at a 90-degree angle. You need to bring the roof line down. And we had to make a call, like, do we listen to the best practices of the expert architects, or do we listen to the local community? And we made the wrong call. We listened to the architects, and we kept the designs the way they were. 6 months later, I got a call from the head of the local nonprofit we were partnered with for this project, and she said, guess what? And she sent me photos of water damage on the side of the first 50 houses that had been built, and we had to go back, repair that, and then change the design because the local community knew best what they really needed in that house design. And I think that's just an example of why you really need to listen to the local community, and they know their problems, they know their solutions, they know the opportunities they see in front of them. The second thing I would say, and again, this is touching on some of what's already been talked about, is if you can, do general operating support. Almost look at your philanthropy as being a VC. You are getting behind a local organization that's doing great work. You're a private philanthropist. You can afford to invest in the leadership of the local organizations as opposed to treating local organizations as contractors for projects. And the more that you can move to that kind of model, I think the more you're going to see long-term impact with those local organizations in their communities, because you're not just investing in their short-term success, you're investing in their vision of what they want their community to be.
So clearly one big lesson for me, which is why I'm actually no longer practicing as an architect, is don't listen to architects. Because they will always get it wrong.
Sorry.
No, that's absolutely true. So let me just first of all, both of you, thank you so very much, and just a few thoughts. I think we are a very interesting space, right? And the space for us is we want to help, but we don't want to feel uncomfortable. I think the lesson of this conference, and it's something Katie said in the morning also, was we cannot predetermine the outcome. We've got to trust the folks that are living the experience and are proximate to their own lives to determine the outcome, which essentially for us working from here makes us extremely uncomfortable. As humans, we actually don't like to be uncomfortable. So the big lesson is, how do we become comfortable with being uncomfortable? And that, to me, is what you both are actually trying to do with your work in the way that you are showing up with both resources, acumen, and capacity building. So thank you very much, and thank you all very much for being part of this.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you for just that conversation, and really sparked some new ideas for me even after this full day.